number of years, and who has worked in many areas, fundamental areas of Bayesian statistics and computational tools, motivated by a large range of applications, which come both from geospatial work, biodiversity, all sorts of interaction with the natural world, maybe I could say, if that's fair, from David's work, but then abstracting the problems and actually looking at generic structures and generic ways of tackling these problems. And I think today we're all very intrigued to hear your interpretable deep structure, so which fits very well with some of the more medical and biological example that we are grappling with here. We're always interested to go from motivating application to trying to understand the structures and different ways of doing that. So without further ado, shall I invite you to start your slides?
Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks for the kind introduction and the invitation. And so yeah, I'll go ahead, and please, I'm not much of an expert on Microsoft Teams, so if anyone has a question, just call it out, and I'm happy to be interrupted, and I think that makes it more interesting for everyone. Okay, and I should first mention that this is joint work with a postdoc I have, Yuki Gu, who's really fantastic. She's going into a faculty position at Columbia University, and she is really the leader of this work. Okay, and so yeah, so this Bayesian pyramid idea, and one of our motivations, the motivations that I've had, is that there's been this kind of rise in kind of deep learning and these kind of multi-layer, really complicated models that are essentially black boxes. And it would be really nice to be able to kind of peel open the black box and be able to interpret some of the structure there, but that can be very, very unreliable when people do that. And so so for that reason, I'll kind of start out with a bit of theory for a structure of models that we're going to call Bayesian pyramids. And then I'll get more into the methodology, and then I'll have an actual biomedical example at the end. Okay. And so one of the things I've been really interested in, and Sylvia has also been interested in, is latent variable models. And so so we've worked a lot on, so Yuki made this kind of table to kind of set the stage of what we're talking about today. And so I've done a lot of work on factor analysis, which is more, you have maybe continuous latent factors underlying maybe high dimensional data. If you have categorical data underlying some data, then you're often thinking about clustering. And so you might have something like this, where you have some data, maybe it's in higher dimensions, and you'd like to group them into some sort of groups. And so I've worked a lot on this type of problem, but one thing I've noticed is that, particularly in high dimensional examples, lately we've been working in biodiversity and neuroscience and epidemiology. It's often too simple to say that we can take some sort of high dimensional data and we can break it into a single set of groups. And so, like underlying high dimensional data, we have a single categorical latent variable, which is telling you which group it's in. And so that's a bit of a simplification, I think. And so one of the motivations of what I'll talk about today is to give a kind of more nuanced or kind of finer grained version of clustering through a kind of multi-layer latent class model. Okay, so I'll just kind of skip this, but the what we're extending is the latent class model, where we have maybe sort of P categorical variables, and I'll focus mostly on categorical data today. And we might have one categorical latent class underlying that. And so that would be type of latent class model or clustering model. And so that I'd view as often too simple, particularly if the number of variables you have is large, and you might have different types of variables as well. Okay. And so in modern applications that might be high dimensional, we'd like to do a variety of extensions of the classical latent class model. We might first add more than one latent class, and so we have some sort of latent trait model where we have multiple traits instead of just a single one. We might also put in some type of sparse graphical structure between the latent variables and the observed variables. Maybe a given observed variable might only depend on a subset of the latent variables. And we might also, following this kind of recent trend in machine learning, define a deep structure. And so where we don't have just a single layer of latent variables, we might have multiple layers of latent variables. Okay, and this is related to models that have been very popular in machine learning, but those models are completely uninterpretable. And so we'd like to kind of move towards having something that is interpretable. And so to just kind of show a bit of what we mean by Bayesian pyramids, it's almost like a special case of Bayesian networks where you have a network, a Bayesian network in this type of structure where the bottom layer are P. In this setting, we could extend it certainly, but in this talk, they're going to be categorical variables. And so we have P observed categorical variables. And then we have multiple layers of discrete latent variables. And the deepest one we'll use a different notation we'll call Z. So there's a single root node Z, which is a categorical variable. And that could be, you could view that as a cluster. But instead of the cluster directly impacting the observed variables, it goes through these multiple layers of say, binary latent variables. And so the type of research questions we're interested in is, I think that, I'm very applied, motivated statistician. I work on real world problems, often biomedical and biological research. But I'd like to, I think it's really important to look initially theoretically and say, okay, well, if we have something like this, what can we identify? What can we reliably estimate based on the observed data? And when can we do that? And what types of constraints do we need to incorporate to be able to do that? Because I'd like to be actually able to identify the structure underlying data, maybe to do exploratory data analysis, something like that. And then once we have that question answered and we have some theory there, can we methodologically say, how do we infer the latent structure? How do we infer the model parameters? We'll take a Bayesian approach, but one could do other things, of course, once we have identifiability, because we'll be talking about identifiability sort of in a general sense, not in a Bayesian sense. Okay, and so the first question is theoretically when and what discrete latent structures can lead to model identifiability. And I think it's simplest to start with a simple case where we just have a single latent variable, and then that relates to constrained tensor decomposition. Okay, so let's go back to the classical latent class model. And so we have for categorical variables, so we might have like P variables that could be arranged in a contingency table. And we're thinking that, well, maybe those variables can be viewed as conditionally independent given some latent class variable Z. And if you do that, you can write it as essentially a mixture model. And this is a very old model where you say the joint probability mass function of these P categorical variables, Y1 through YP, can be written as a mixture over K components, with the mixture weight on the H component being nu H. And so that you could think of that being as the probability that an individual is in subpopulation H. And then conditionally on being in subpopulation H, the different categorical variables are all independent. And so then you just have kind of independent product multinomial distribution. So lambda J CJH, that would be for the jth categorical variable. What's the probability it falls in level CJ in subpopulation or cluster H? Okay, and so this is a classical model. And so we could introduce to this model a type of constraint. And so we could introduce a binary constraint matrix. This is what we're going to do. And so this constraint matrix is P by K. So P is the number of outcomes and K is the number of levels of the latent class variable. And we're going to say that SJH1 is equal to SJH2 is equal to 0. Then that means that there's going to be some ties in the lambdas, in those category probabilities across different levels of the latent class. Okay, and so that's going to take this original latent class model and simplify it by putting in ties in the category probabilities across classes. Okay. So we can call that a constrained latent class model. So then we can certainly, independently of the constraints, really write down the distribution of y, in this form. And so that's just, really the same as the model in the previous slide. And then you can write it as a probability tensor, really. And so you because you could think, well, the probability mass function for p categorical variables, that's like a contingency table. You can put those variables in a contingency table, and the probability in each cell that would be viewed across the table as a probability tensor, because we have probabilities that, you know, particular y1 up to yp or taking a particular value, that's a particular cell, that's a probability. And we can just write down basically a tensor factorization of that probability tensor. Okay, and so this is just a really simple CP type tensor factorization. Yeah. Okay, and so then if once you do that, really recovering the parameters from y. So we're thinking like, oh well, how can we recover parameters lambda and nu subject to constraints s from y? Well, that's just a constrained tensor decomposition problem, and so can be turned into a type of really algebra problem. And so, so to just go a little bit into the theory, we can define a Cattry-Rao product in this way, and then we can just define this proposition. So if we define the Cattry-Rao product, so these are across the lambdas. So the lambdas are these category probabilities within each latent class, and so we just take those lambdas, and then we just take this Cattry-Rao product over the different variables. Then we have these 2 points. And so the first point is that if the k column vectors of the constraint matrix are distinct, then this k, this Cattry-Rao product of the lambdas, must have full column rank. And if S contains identical column vectors, then k can be ranked deficient. Okay. And so that just kind of sets us up to kind of define some type of constraints on this latent class model so that we can identify the model. Okay, and so before we do that, just to provide, there's different notions of identifiability. So strict identifiability in this context means that, you know, if these probabilities are different, if and only if the parameters are different, including also as a parameter the constraint matrix S that we might actually want to infer from the data. Okay, so if that's true, then we can have a theorem. And so our theorem is that if we have a constrained latent class model, the parameters, the nu, those are just the mixture weights, and the lambdas are just the category probabilities for each of the variables and each of the subpopulations. And we have our constraint matrix, which defines ties. And then we take p, like this bracket p, that just means 1 to p. So if we break up the p variables into 3 sets, A1, A2, and A3, and we do that in this following way. So the submatrix S of A1 has distinct column vectors for A1 and 2. So this submatrix, that's S, that's just taking the A is going to define a subset of 1 to P, A1, and we would just take the rows of S such that you're in that subset. So if that the first 2 have distinct column vectors, and then the you know, you have a more slightly complicated constraint on the second one, which I'll simplify in the next slide. Then lambda, S, and nu are strictly identifiable. So we have this nice strict identifier on the constraint matrix and on nu. Okay, and so a simpler version would be that that you have a constrained latent class model. We're forcing the weights to be positive. Otherwise, you could imagine if you had a weight being 0, then you can't estimate the corresponding lambdas, and so you have to force the weights to be positive. If the weight was 0, that would correspond to basically reducing k by 1, and so that's not really a constraint. That's just to make the model reasonable. So then if we can break it into 3 blocks, then such that each submatrix has distinct column vectors for each block, then they're strictly identifiable. Okay, so this is a pretty simple condition. And it just depends on the structure of this binary constraint matrix. So we don't have to constrain nu other than just to be positive. We don't have to constrain lambda. It's just on the probability simplex. And we can just have this simple constraint on S. And so that'll make it a lot easier to extend the theory and also apply it in practice if we want to put this constraint in our model that we're implementing. Okay. And so I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I'll just say in passing that if we have identifiability, we can get things like posterior consistency really quite easily, as long as we don't have like a stupid prior, as long as our prior assign some, probability would have full support or support around the true parameter values. Okay, and so so that first snippet of the identifiability theory was just for, a classical latent class model with constraints. And so by putting in these constraints, we can actually you kind of leverage between the classical latent class model and this kind of broad class of Bayesian pyramids. Okay. And so we're going to kind of go from the classical latent class model to these latent pyramids by generalizing to have these multiple deep layers of latent binary variables in a directed sparse graph. Okay, so let's just look at a simple example to start. And so we would just have a 3-layer deal. And so we have this deep Z, and we have 2 alphas, and then we have the Ys. Okay, and so then we're going to define this graphical matrix G, which is going to be 3 by 2, which is encoding the connections between the layers. Okay. And so, this is going to correspond essentially to a constraint structure. You could imagine, flattening this out and defining a corresponding classical latent class model with a particular constraint matrix. And so that's good. There's going to be an equivalence there that we're going to exploit theoretically. Okay, and so here's our general formulation of a Bayesian pyramid. So we have this deep Z, which is a categorical variable. We're going to suppose we could make them more levels, but in practice we're going to make these alphas binary, and then we're going to have the G's. So it's the Z's to the first layer is fully connected, and then the second layer to the third layer, and the third layer to the fourth layer, etc. Those are going to be characterized. The edges are going to be characterized by these G matrices. Okay, and we're going to have this. The distribution of each variable depends only on its parent, so you can't skip a layer or anything like that. Okay. So this is a Bayesian pyramid. So the parents of Yj's are specified by the graphical matrix, the G superscript 1, and the little gjk, that's going to tell you which edges, the edges between a particular Y, the jth Y, and, the kth parent. If there's an edge there, then that's going to be indicated by the gjk1. And then, as you go up, then the parents of the parents will be characterized by this G2. And so you can just really define, it's a pretty simple class of models. And so the conditional distribution on the observed layer, that would just be, it's just conditionally independent of all of the variables on the observed data layer are conditionally independent given the 1-layer deep parents. Okay. And so you can just write it all as like just a simple product, the probability mass function for j equals 1 to p of the probability that of Yj, given the parents. And then you can just like iterate through the layers. So it has this kind of Markov structure across this pyramid. Okay. It's not a tree, you see, because that's why it's not a tree, because you can cross. You don't have a branch and then it just goes down. Like you can go down and then go back across. Like this image here. Okay, and so so then we consider Bayesian pyramid with D latent layers and with these binary graphical matrices describing the edges between each adjacent set, each layer. Those are the G's. So if we marginalize out all the latent variables except alpha 1, so the alpha 1s are, remember, those are the one level below Y. Okay, then the distribution of Y is a constrained latent class model. That's our original model we were talking about with 2 to the K1. K1 is the number of binary features in that 1-layer deep, that alpha 1 layer. And so you could think we could just take a K level thing and we could just expand it into binary indicators. And then we can define a corresponding constraint matrix. Yeah, so we can turn the S, we can figure out what the S is based on the alphas and the G's. Okay, so we're just converting back from the Bayesian pyramid to allow us to use our original theorem, adapt our original theorem. And so you can also do this. You can continue this as you go deeper. I'm not going to go. This is kind of a more pragmatic audience, so I won't go into more details about that. But you can just kind of propagate this argument. Okay, and so so if we look at this toy example, then this just kind of shows how we can turn the G's, which are describing the edges between each adjacent layer, back into S's, which are the constraint matrix in that original classical latent class model. And this allows us to have a general theorem. And so if we just say that, suppose each G, M, is of size Km. So Km is just the number of latent variables we have in layer M. And so, and Km by Km. And so that takes the following form after some row permutation. So we can move around the rows, and after we move around the rows, we have stacked identity matrices, and then we have an unstructured matrix at the bottom. Okay? And so if that's true, if we can write G in that way, then after, up to a latent variable permutation, so you can always permute the latent variables, the ordering, then we can identify the probability distribution tau of the Z, of the deepest latent variable. So that just is the probability mass function. The probability Z takes values 1, 2, 3, etc. And we can identify the conditional probability table of each variable. Okay, so as you go from the Z one level down, the conditional probability distribution given the Z, we can identify that. We can identify as you go down. So you basically can identify the full probabilistic structure under this constraint on the edges. Yeah, you have some sort of sparsity constraint on the edges in your Bayesian pyramid, and then you can identify everything. Okay, so so that requires you to vertically stack those three matrices. I think it's just a constraint that we need to put in enough sparsity in the pyramid. Okay, so so let's go to some more pragmatic things like, well, this Bayesian pyramid, this is just this completely arbitrary setting. We haven't put in anything. That just shows the graphical structure. We need to put in a specific model to really kind of show what's going on. And so, one model we'll be focusing on is what we call a main effect model. And so this would say that, okay, so now let's say we're in layer M. And so what's the probability that, the kth latent variable in layer M is a 1 instead of a 0? And we would then condition on, the parent layer. All the alphas are in the parent layer. We condition on the G, which describes where the edges occur between the parent layer and the current layer. And we also introduce some parameters beta, which are characterizing the magnitude of the effect, the kind of main effect of the parents. Okay. And so here we have F. You could think this is just like maybe some generalized linear model. So F is the link function. And now we have some sort of baseline parameter. And then now we sum over all the parents. And so this K prime is indexing the parents. We're taking, there's an edge. That would mean the G is 1. We look at all the parents that have an edge to the current node that we're looking at. And then we look at the effect of that parent, and we have a coefficient. If the parent has a 1, and that would be alpha, that alpha K prime M plus 1 would be 1. And then we have this betas characterizing the effect of that parent. So if the parent exists, if it's a 1, then what's the effect on the next layer? That's the betas. Okay. So this is a pretty nice model. Yuki thought about these more elaborate models with interactions and things, and I didn't think that was probably overkill if we had interactions between the different parents. So you could make it more parsimonious, but by doing various indicator functions and things. But we're going to stick with this kind of main effect model as our kind of practical model that we'll think of using. You can think of any sort of complicated model as long as your graphical constraints are followed. You can obtain identifiability. So one reason we're going to focus on this main effect model is that it kind of reminds one a lot of deep belief networks, which are one of these kind of popular deep learning methods, but for which not much is known at all in terms of identifiability, and so people use this as a black box for prediction. And if you did try to interpret one of the nodes in that network, it might just be completely garbage and very unreliable. And every time you run it, you might get a very different network. Okay, and so there are some related models, some multidimensional discrete latent variable models. And so Yuki had worked a lot on psychometrics and educational testing applications in her PhD dissertation. And so she had run into a lot of these kind of cognitive diagnostic models, and so you could imagine that their setting might be almost more item response theory. You give students lots of different questions, and then you might think that, okay, well, we have some latent traits that are encoding whether they know they have a particular skill or not. And so in that type of setting, you can rely on some, well, is this the skills that are arranged in a hierarchy? And so these are almost like known skills, like do I have some competent knowledge of calculus, and then do I have some do I have knowledge of some sort of subtopic in calculus, and that's going to determine whether I answer these questions right or not. And so that type of application. And so there's studies on identifiability, but very limited, and they don't really apply at all in our context. In machine learning, there is a lot of related work. I mentioned deep belief networks, but also latent tree models. Our pyramids aren't trees, but if we made them trees, they would be related to latent tree models. It also reminds one of a sum product network as well, and so that's cool. But and so these models are very, 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 very popular, cited tens of thousands of times often, but widely used in machine learning, computer science, biomedical research applications increasingly, but identifiability is almost always ignored. Okay. So we have this general identifiability theory, but let's kind of get into methodologically how are we going to implement some of these approaches. Okay, and to do that, we're going to make it kind of more tractable by focusing initially on this structure. Yeah, and so we won't make it like 10 layers deep or try to infer the number of layers or anything crazy like that. We'll just let's just say we have this two-latent-layer or three-layer overall, and so we have some deep categorical variable, and we have some intermediate alphas that are binary, and then we have some y's. And one reason I really love this model is that I've worked so much over the years on clustering and Bayesian nonparametric methods for clustering, trying to do robust methods for clustering. And I'm often thinking of like, well, we have something like Z, but Z we don't have the alphas, and we directly link the Z to the Ys. And then you run into some issues like, well, maybe like then B, the number of levels of Z has to be really big to explain the Ys. And so here we might be able to make B much smaller, but we allow more variation by having Z be one level up and then putting in these intermediate alphas. And so I think that this is a really promising way to think about kind of a more nuanced view on clustering that would be much more appropriate for high dimensional data and many biomedical data sets. Okay, and so so we have full connections between Z and the alpha ones, and so we're going to need to model we would model the probability mass function of Z as just unrestricted, and then we're going to model the alphas and the probability mass function of alpha given Z's, and then we have these links, the G's, and they're linked to Y's, and we're going to do that through essentially logistic regressions. Okay, can make things simple. So we're saying, okay, well, let's say the probability that Yij, the jth categorical variable for the ith subject, it takes level C, conditionally on the parent alphas. Okay, so that's just going to be a logistic regression model. So this is pretty much our main effect model, except we've just written it in a slightly different way. So before I had K such that some GJKs are equal to 1. So now I've just pulled in the GJK into the term. So the GJK, those are just indicating whether there's an edge. Alpha K is 1 if the parent node has a 1 and a 0 if the parent node has a 0, and then the betas are characterizing the level of impact of the parent node on Y. Okay, so that's a relatively quite simple model. And here's the kind of deeper latent structure. And so we're saying that so we have an unconstrained probability mass function for Z, and then we just we don't put any constraints also on the probability mass function for alpha given Z. They're just binary, and so we just allow these binary probabilities to be different in each of the for each level of Z. Okay. Okay, so just to mention real quick, for this model, since it's a parametric model, the specific parametric form allows us to relax the identifiability conditions, and so we can use generic identifiability instead of strict identifiability, which just means that the parameters are identified almost everywhere, and so there might be some Lebesgue measure 0 set that they're not identified, but that's not going to create problems for our statistical model practically. And so, yeah, I'm not gonna belabor this too much, but one thing is that it's nice is that it tells us a bit about how many classes we can have and things like that, the identifiability theory. Okay, so we're going to define two classes of Bayesian inference methods. The first is just for fixed k. So k is the number of latent classes, in this alpha layer. So let's just say if it was fixed, then we would have a simpler model, and then we're going to do something slightly more complicated, which will be what we do in the applications. And so what are the unknown parameters that we have? Well, we have these G's really, and then we have sigma squared K's, and we have the betas, and we can just define a simple model here. And so here we're doing this thing. It's basically a spike slab type model, and so if the GK is equal to 1, then the beta JK should be in there. But if GK equals 0, then there's no beta JK, really. But we're going to define the pseudo prior, which is something that's been done in the literature in the second line here. And so that would be, we're going to define that if there's no edge, then really beta JK doesn't appear in the likelihood, but we're going to anyway give it a prior just for MCMC purposes with some small variance, which needs to be carefully chosen. We tune it to give good performance algorithmically. And so that you could imagine that, I've turned off the edge, but now my beta JK is still moving around, and now I can turn back on the edge, and now it's going to kind of start out at a small value and then maybe move away from that small value. And we were able to get an MCMC to work for this quite efficiently. Yes. And so in practice we might not want to have fixed k though, and so instead we could choose an upper bound for k. And so this is closely related to some work we've been doing over the years on factor models, continuous factor models, and factorizations where you don't know what the number of latent factors is. And so in factor models, you might have some factor loadings matrix. And so if I don't know the number of factors, one trick I could do is I could say, I'm gonna put too many factors in. I'm gonna put 20 factors in where I might think I might only need 5 or 10. And now I have this factor loadings matrix. I'm gonna choose a shrinkage prior for the factor loadings matrix that increasingly shrinks the different columns of the matrix, so that the later columns are going to tend to be very close to 0, and then effectively you're then throwing out factors, okay? And so we had an approach that was reasonably popular for that, and Bhattacharya and Dunson in 2011 in Biometrica. And we had a recent paper that just came out in Biometrica with Sirio Legramonti and Daniele Durante, which potentially improves upon that method. And we have another method as well that we just put up on arXiv and submitted that puts in more structure into that shrinkage prior, where you have covariates. Like in biomedical applications, I might have meta covariates or covariates on each variable. So if I knew something like not for the subject covariate, but a variable level covariate, so I had some sort of gene ontology or functional annotation, you can include that in our new approach. Okay. But here we use this cumulative shrinkage process, we call it, from this recent Biometrica paper. And it allows us to infer the number of factors we need, and we adapted it from this kind of continuous factor case to this setting here. And it just has a simple form. It leads to a simple Gibbs sampler, and we found it worked quite well in our simulations. Okay. So yeah, so to do the Gibbs sampler, we rely on this something we use a lot, which is this kind of wonderful Polya gamma data augmentation scheme of Nick Poulsen and his collaborators. And so they came up with this way where you have a logistic regression, you can introduce some latent variables. And now if you have sort of Gaussian or conditional Gaussian priors, you can maintain conjugacy, and you can do that really, turn it into a simple Gibbs sampler. And so we kind of marry his approach with this kind of older approach, brilliant approach by Chris Holmes and Leo Held, which I've used a lot and I'm a fan of. Okay, and so so for fixed k we can do that, and for unknown k, k star, we just put an upper bound. Then we can just really easily use this cumulative shrinkage process prior, and then just modify the Gibbs sampler in a simple way. And so so yeah, it gives you inferences on the number of latent factors. Okay, and so this allows us to really infer the entire latent structure, the locations of the G's, the sparsity structure in this latent graph, and the model parameters. Okay, so we tried it out in a simulation study to start, and so we wanted to see, for example, whether this KSP prior would actually figure out the number of factors. And so the right is the truth. So the truth was that there was 4 factors, 4 binary latent traits. And then there's 20 observed variables, and we had this particular structure in the betas. So there was some sparsity structure there. And, that's putting the betas together with the G's. And so if we had n equals 500, we can see that it did a pretty darn good job of figuring out that there was 4 traits. You can see there is a bit of yellowish, and so there are kind of and that's where we can see like simulation consistency, where then there's like essentially probability 0, really small probability on those 5th, 6th, and 7th traits. And in practice, if you chose an upper bound and you occupied, if we chose the upper bound of 7 and then we got results where you're using all 7 factors, then I would recommend increasing the upper bound. One could imagine trying to do some Bayesian nonparametric approach, but I pragmatically, I don't think it's worth it. I think these kind of overfitted factor models are fine. Yeah. Okay, so we also looked at errors in estimating the G matrix. You could imagine that we're looking at edges between latent variables. Like maybe that's really hard to estimate, but we saw that the estimation error went down really quickly with sample size. So if you had a tiny sample size relative to the size of your data, you might not be able to accurately infer latent factors. You might need a bigger sample size. But here I would note that at n equals 750, we were getting quite good results, and getting pretty crappy results at n equals 250. But if you look at the size of this contingency table, we have a contingency table data. So we have 4 level categorical variables, and we have 20 categorical variables. And so, from the standpoint of contingency tables, this is a huge contingency table because the number of cells is huge in this table, and it's certainly very massively bigger than the sample size. So, of course, in practice and genomics and things, we'd like to be able to consider tables with thousands or millions of variables. But yeah. Do what you can. Okay, so here's just mean square error for some of the parameters. You have these deeper tensor arms, and you have the main effects, and those are also decreasing quite steadily with the sample size. Just say the mixing was quite good as well. I mean, I think that if we added another layer and added 100 times as many variables, then probably our current algorithm, I don't know if it would work amazingly well in that case, and so that would be an open area trying to figure out how to scale it up. Okay, so the last thing I'm gonna talk about is this application to nucleotide sequence data. So this is an example from a publicly available data set, but I do work quite a bit on genomics, but so to just provide some background, so these are nucleotide sequence data. So we have a sequence of ACGTs, and we're looking particularly at splice junction data. And so there's regions which are removed during our RNA transcription process. So you could call those introns. Regions used to generate mRNA or exons, and we have these junctions between introns and exons, are splice junctions. And there's considered to be 3 types, three coarse types. Maybe there's subtypes of the types, as we'll see in the results. So there's exon intron, intron exon, and neither EI or IE. okay? And so we have these three types. So we have this data set where those are labeled, okay? Okay, so we took this from the UCI machine learning repository. I wanted to use a public data set so that people could replicate our results. I'm happy to, we just put the code up on GitHub, and I'm really happy for people to try it and tell us how it fails. That would be fantastic. So there's 3,175 nucleotide sequences, each of length 60. And so we have the data set are sort of like this. And so we have this, we have these types. Kind of, might call them coarse scale types, which are like EI, IE, and N. And so each sequence is in one of those three categories. There's also a sequence name, which I don't know enough about this application area to know much about the name, but we'll see like the A's, if you look at the A's, they actually match the names a lot. And so as we'll see later, but what we're going to do is we have an unsupervised method. And so we're going to hold out the sequence name, hold out the type, and just analyze the sequence data using our Bayesian pyramids. And then we're going to infer like a Z, a deep latent class, and then we're going to also infer these A's. And then we want to see, how well does that align with the type and the sequence name. And we'd also like to see how well that summarizes the data, because one thing that we'd like to be able to do is we have big complicated data. We summarize it with some lower dimensional latent factors. We would like those latent factors to not be discarding too much information. So can we use those latent factors to actually predict the held out type as accurately as some complicated black box applied to the original sequencing data? Surprisingly, we will see that that is the case here. Okay, so we applied the cumulative shrinkage process. We just choose 7 latent binary indicators, and we obtained 5. It inferred 5. So we're only using the nucleotide sequence data, and we have 3 deep latent categories. We chose that by kind of the B, the number of the levels of Z. We could have also done some overfitted thing there, or Bayesian nonparametrics, but we just did like model diagnostics, and so we would try for different values and compare kind of goodness of fit metrics. So here's some of the data analysis results. And so what do we get out of this? And so we get this kind of estimated G matrix. So those are giving you this kind of loadings, and we get this A matrix, we get the Z matrix, and then we have the held out. And so just looking initially, so the first thing is across the different loci, we get loadings for the different binary latent variables. Okay, that's for the G. For the second one, we get across the different sequences. We get these kind of binary latent variables, and then we get across the different sequences, we get, well, which of the 3 categories are we in terms of Z? And we can see, just glancing initially, it looks like, oh, well, the Z is actually is figuring out this EI, IE versus N pretty accurately, just glancing initially at this estimated Z matrix. If you took the data and you threw out the intermediate layer, then we wouldn't have ended up with B equals 3. We would have blown up B, and then we would have lost that correspondence. And so we're getting much better clustering by doing this multi-layer thing. The G hat describes how the 60 loci load on the binary traits. So you can sort of see that the first 27 loci show similar loadings. They load on the first 4, but not on the 5th. The middle 10 load on all, and then the last 23 are sparser. So that's potentially interesting. So we can maybe look at it more carefully from a biologic perspective to try to get some insight. This is really an exploratory data analysis tool, I would say. Yeah, so we can also we can say that, so we have these latent traits, and so if we have A, I, K, it's equal to 1 if sequence I possesses latent trait K. So what we can do is we can use these A's, and we can use the Z's, and then we can see how well we want to interpret those, and we also want to see how well they do in predicting held out information like that EI, et cetera, the type of splice junction. Okay, so what we're going to do in that respect is we're going to assess how those latent features perform in downstream classification of sequence types. Okay, and so to do that, we want to do, I was motivated a bit because Cynthia Rudin is at Duke, and she's a bit advocate of interpretable machine learning, and she likes these rule list approaches a lot, which are, give you a very, transparent classification method that you could use like in a doctor's office or physician or something like that. You could look at it and just say it's very simple. So here what we did is we took our estimated Z, our estimated alphas, and then we just stuck it into a rules list classifier to find the best rule list classifier for predicting our held out EI versus IE versus N. And we got the, so we did that. So we had these sequences, and so we're going to define a classifier using this kind of rule list approach. Okay, so and so this is what we get. So this is I was pretty excited about this, as was Yuki. And so you can say, oh, we're going to conclude that the ith sequence is EI if the first latent trait is 1 and the fifth latent trait is 1. We conclude that it's IE if the deep latent class variable is 1, and we include that it's N if the deep latent class variable is 0 and AI5 equals 0. Okay, and so we get this really, really simple rule, and we can go back and I won't show the results here, but the A's do have correspondence with the name, and so we have this information from the data set. We have the EI, IE, N, but we also have the name. And so the AIs are giving you a more nuanced version, telling you about something other than this, coarsely EI, IE, N, is breaking it up on a finer scale. So if we look at then the predictive performance out of sample for this classification algorithm, which is absurdly simple based on the learned features that we got from our Bayesian pyramid, then it does amazingly well. And so the downstream classification accuracy exceeds 95% for all 3 nucleotide sequence types. You can see that in the diagonal elements of this confusion matrix. And in fact, it does as well as, an application of, fine-tuned convolutional neural nets. And so they took some big black box in this previous paper, applied it to the same data set. They tuned it, hand-tuned it, and they got the same classification accuracy that we got using this very interpretable, simple, identifiable model. And so I was quite excited about that. That might not happen in other cases. I think often you might pay a price for interpretability. But okay, so I'm gonna stop there. But so theoretically, we developed this general theory for identifiability, which I think is pretty exciting. And I think that, the identifiability theory is important in these types of methods, because if we're going to have some deep, complicated structure, it's not at all obvious that the data are going to inform about that structure and how they inform about the structure. And so we need to be doing more of this type of theory, I think. And methodologically, we have this Bayesian approach to infer the latent structure, and it seems to do well, at least in cases we've looked at. I'm excited to apply it in bigger, more complicated cases. We do have some biodiversity results from this life plan project I have that are in progress, but that I won't show today. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. This is really very stimulating. So this is open. I'm saying that at 3 o'clock I have to go to another meeting, but I don't want, because to stop the discussion, I'm sure if I have to go, but I'm apologizing in advance. But
that's no problem.
I will hand over to whoever, to you yourself or to whoever. Can any, shall I monitor the chat? But I think please unmute yourself and ask questions.
I can't see the chat. I'm a sort of a
I think I can see the chat, but I think I would prefer people just to start unmuting themselves. And anyway, maybe I could start the talk. I think indeed this is a very nice way of thinking of decomposing basically the heterogeneity in this kind of flexible way, but nevertheless a structured way, which is more interpretable. I was just wondering, what so of course it works very well for categorical data. Now, what would happen if you actually try to discretize? So basically, if you've got continuous data and you just discretize, just quintiles or something like that. I mean, have you ever and then just try to apply it to that? Would it be, what would be missing in a way, or could you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, certainly you could do that. What would be missing is it would, other than like maybe potential loss of information by categorizing, is it wouldn't be exploiting the ordering. Like if I took like a 5-level thing, like this is like it's sort of unordered categorical data.
Yes.
To have ordering, you could still apply it there, but it wouldn't be taking advantage of the ordering. I think you can certainly define a Bayesian pyramid for continuous data. In that case, our identifiability theory wouldn't hold. And it's sort of like a different mathematical game to establish that identifiability theory. Though it would be promising that if it's identifiable in the categorical case, that hopefully it would be in the continuous case, but it is a different mathematical game because we're sort of writing down this tensor factorization, doing this algebra. And it's a different game, really.
And so, it's got this game, this particular game has a lot of benefits for, I think, first, I mean, in a way, it's more non-parametric because and also I think computationally, and indeed you could exploit, a lot of the structure, the linear algebra come into, and so I think it has a lot of benefits in a way, and because, as you probably, struggle with very high dimensional continuous mixtures, this becomes very unwieldy. But here somehow
the kernel, I mean, in those high dimensional cases, we had this recent paper that we keep getting rejected for some reason, though I'm like really super excited about it, which was the other option for what I might have presented today, where we're kind of showing this pitfall of clustering Bayesian clustering in high dimensions. As P increases, you sort of tend to converge to a degenerate limit where you just either put everyone in the same cluster or put everyone in different clusters. Yeah, I mean, I think that you're so sensitive to the kernel and this continuous clustering. And so, yeah, the categorical helps you a lot in that sense. It's also more interpretable as well. So.
It would be interesting if you had an example where you to try in a way both, and then just understand what how much you're losing. Is there somewhere you could compensate by maybe slightly generalizing your sort of linear structure, your sort of additive, I suppose if you added some extra terms there, you might recapture something of the.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to take over the whole of the discussion. Now, I'm looking at the chat. I'm sure that other people would want to ask questions.
May I ask a question, David, Sylvia?
Yes,
sure.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sanmitra. I'm a postdoc here. Great talk. Thank you for that. My question is regarding actually the main effect layer. So for example, in machine learning, one of the problem of interpretability actually comes from this chaining of a nonlinear function. I mean, like if we remove that nonlinear function, then we can have very deep model, but that's just linear transformation of a matrix, a sequence, or in sequence. I mean, like in your case, you have you develop this very nice model which hints towards interpretability, but then your model still has that chaining of a link function. And I assume we still do not understand what that brings into effect. So I was wondering whether your theoretical results give some hint onto that. And a following question is whether your theoretical results give some hint towards the incentive of having a more deeper model. That is, whether you have your, I mean, like your theoretical results tells us about why should we have more layers rather than one.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Thanks.
a great question. I mean, because that's been like an open, because statistically we're often like, that's something I've thought about separately is, oh, well, you just like have one layer and just make the one layer richer, then you should just be fine. What's the advantage? And so, yeah, and the kind of continuous case, then you have to define some sort of truth class that likes the convolutional structure that can take advantage of that and is kind of sparser or low dimensional. So it's capturing, it's sort of more concentrated around truths that we see more often in real data examples. I would say that, yeah, you're totally right. I mean, we weren't trying to interpret too much the betas, you know, those actual coefficients that we have. So we're chaining these kind of nonlinear functions in this logistic regression. And so what we were interpreting was those kind of latent traits, which become more interpretable. But to try to start then interpreting the betas, we haven't tried to do that. And in terms of whether the theory provides us some sort of insight into why deep, I would love to work on that, and I have initial ideas, but this current theory does not do that. So what we're instead doing, we would say like, oh, we have a particular model, and we didn't try to identify the number of layers. We can identify the sparsity structure and the number of factors. So we can identify that given that we have 3 layers. And then we're like, okay, well then, given that we have 3 layers, how does the data Y inform about the model parameters, including the sparsity structure? The theory is about that, and so that by construction doesn't tell you why use 3 or 4 or 5 layers. But that's an amazingly interesting question, and I think that to answer that, you almost have to get back to this issue of, you know, what types of the true data, like how do we compress the true data and represent it more parsimoniously? Probably you can do that by like going 4, 5, 6 layers deep, rather than having like 1 layer and then blowing up the number of classes to an enormous level. You probably have more parsimony for more true data sets. Going deeper would be my intuition. So yes. That would be cool to work on.
Thanks.
I'm really sorry to leave this discussion, but I
no problem. Great to see you.
No, I'll listen to the end of the discussion since it's recorded.
I'm not offended at all.
David, can I ask about how this work is connected to the work by Sarah Wade on enriched Dirichlet processes? Because there's a nesting structure there as well.
Yeah, actually, I was visiting Bocconi, and you know, under discussions with Sonia Petroni, we came up with this enriched Dirichlet process. So I guess I was one of the originators of that, and so the motivation for that I posed to Sonia was like, if you're doing joint modeling, so if you have joint modeling like X and Y, and this is something Sylvia's worked on. If you just do a joint model and like do a joint Dirichlet process mixture model, then what it's going to tend to do is it gives you like too many clusters, and the clusters are just dominated by X and they don't tell you anything about Y. And so by doing the enriched Dirichlet process, which is in some sense it's like a 2-layer thing, and so you're trying to avoid that problem, really was the motivation. And so but there you're defining clusters within clusters, and so it's like a 2-layer thing, but it doesn't have the same structure at all, and it has a somewhat different motivation. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, David. Do you mind if I ask, is the post-processing of like the samples you get from this model, is that much of a headache? Just I can imagine, I know with a Bayesian mixture model, you can have issues like label switching, and just, you know, like how you interpret that can be, you know, a question in itself. So is that much of a headache here? and how do you deal with it?
I mean, like that's something I've thought about a lot, and we're still working on. Like it's amazing, like how that's not a solved problem yet, and I still feels like many of the solutions are ad hoc with this post-processing factor mixture models, and we have like yet another take on that coming out with this work with Federico Ferrari. But here it wasn't a big deal at all. I mean, the only thing we had was the you know, at the end of the day, we only had the label ambiguity, which you always have, and then that was a really simple fix up, and so we just relied on this previous thing, this thing we have coming out to do that, and that works quite well to deal with the label ambiguity. So.
Cool. So it's not inherited by any of the levels.
Yeah, no, you don't have an extra. You know, I could imagine like that you might think you would, but you don't have an extra level of, you know, multi-layered nastiness in the kind of label ambiguity, like label ambiguity, exponentially worse label ambiguity. Yeah, we didn't encounter that.
Great stuff. No, thanks. And also just, I know, how long did it sort of take to run the Gibbs sampler on this?
It's pretty fast. I mean, in that example, I don't remember exactly because yeah, Yuki ran the analysis, but I did ask her, and I just don't remember offhand. I would guess 30 minutes
okay.
For nice. The data example. It's not all that slow. Yeah. Because it's pretty simple, you know, and it's even though there are, you know, there's 60 loci. I mean, I think it's going to bog down if you got 10,000 or something, and then yeah, that's something I'm really interested in, is trying to scale things up to like hundreds of thousands even. But any other questions? I'm happy, like anyone who wants to email me and you know, has complaints or wants to try the code or thinks that things I said were wrong or something. I'm happy to get any of that feedback. I like that sort of thing. So feel free to reach out afterwards.
Cool. No, that was great. Thank you very much for that, David. Yeah, if there's no more questions, no thanks. It was a really interesting talk. It seems like a very exciting sort of development.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thanks.
See you later.
Pleasure. Thanks for your time.
No problem.